and gentlemen, once again, this is Jeremy Smith. Today we're going to be talking about Nikon's new D500. Now guys, you know that a few months ago we did take a look at the D500 as well as the D5 whenever they were both announced, and I had a chance to have my hands on some pre-production Nikon models. But today though, I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience with the D500 so far. Now, I'm not going to go over all the specs again. If you haven't seen my D500 video, I'm going to go ahead and post a little link to it for you guys to see, so you guys can kind of take a look at that in more detail. But on the D500, you know, this camera is something that honestly I was not terribly excited to try, and that's not discounting the fact that it's a big deal, because it is a big deal to have a camera in Nikon's lineup in this range again. You know, not everyone can afford to buy a D5 or D4S or anything like that, and they still want to be able to have something that's very, very quick, that's a legitimate pro body. So this camera definitely meets a need. But for me, you know, not necessarily what I'm absolutely after. Now, this is not a bad thing at all, because obviously there's a lot of photographers out there that need this range of camera. At one point, I said that Nikon should leave all the crop sensor cameras to the soccer moms or something to that effect. Not to offend anyone, but I did say it. I do feel like Nikon's basically made me eat my own words, because this camera is a legitimate pro body. It has the same focus system and the same processor as the one found in the D5, and of course the controls are exactly what you'd expect, which we'll be taking a look at briefly in a moment. But the big reason why a camera like this is not necessarily the camera for me is just because, you know, I don't need the speed, honestly. And I would much rather have a full frame sensor and higher resolution in exchange of speed. Now, with that being said, even though it's been a while since I've used a crop sensor camera for my work, there are still some things that I definitely benefited from in this camera. And for me, this camera shows me what Nikon will have later on in the future in the range of camera that I typically go for, which would be something like the D810 range. The big thing I noticed on this camera, outside of just the crazy burst rate, is that this camera is very, very responsive. For what I do, if a camera can do 3 frames a second, I'm going to be more than happy with it. But what I did find is, even whenever I was not using the burst rate, you know, this camera is still extremely responsive. It has very, very little shutter lag. So basically, whenever I hit the shutter button, it was immediately firing. And I think the autofocus system in this is absolutely phenomenal. Being able to have a lot more cross-type focus points now is a huge, huge deal for me. In the past, you know, basically Nikon's 51-point autofocus system has all of the cross-type points in the middle 3 columns. So all your cross-type points are all jumbled up right here in the middle. So, for example, if I am shooting a vertical photograph, and I'm shooting it at a very high angle or a very low angle, a lot of times I find myself in that position. A lot of times there, you know, especially if I'm shooting at a wider aperture, it's not really a scenario where I can focus and recompose without throwing off my focus. So being able to put the focus point directly on the face of the subject helps out a lot in that scenario. And so now, with those focus points at the very edges of the frame being cross-type, that means a really, you know, means a whole lot for me. And it allows me to have a much, much more accurate focus system, and it makes a big, big difference. So that was one other thing I noticed. I like the ergonomics on this camera. You know, this camera is a lot more akin to the D750 in terms of the shape of its grip, and so that's something that made a difference. The moving screen, it's not something that I thought I would use, but I did use it quite a bit. So all these little things for me have basically added up. As far as I'm concerned, you know, once Nikon takes this type of body style with the focus system and the new responsive processor and puts, you know, they put, say, a 36 megapixel sensor in it that's kind of an improved version of the D810, you know, that would be my perfect camera. And I'm sure we'll no doubt see it in no time. Who is this camera for? If you're doing sports, basically, if you're doing sports and you don't want to spend $6,500 on a camera body, this is the perfect camera for you. 10 frames a second, you know, you can do something insane like 200 raw files before the buffer fills. I mean, it's going to be very, very good for action shooters. Even if you do have a D4S or a D5 or any of those high-end flagship bodies, it's still going to be a camera that you may consider if you need to get a little bit more reach out of your lenses. Because even if you're dealing with a D5, say you're using a 300 millimeter 2.8 to do some baseball photos, you're going to be dealing with 300 millimeter field of view, and you're going to be dealing with 20 megapixels. If you have something like the D500 though, now you've basically, increased your effective field of view, your effective focal length. So you're going to be equivalent to a 450 millimeter lens, but unlike cropping the D4 file, where you're going to end up with less resolution, with this, because it is a smaller sensor, you'll have a 450 millimeter effective field of view, or effective focal length rather, and you will still be at 20 megapixels. So if you need more reach out of your lens, this is going to be a very, very good camera to use. If you are a portrait photographer like me, this is not the camera for you. I still think the D810 makes a lot of sense. Of course, I personally wouldn't buy a D810 at this point. I would wait until a D900 or whatever Nikon decides to call it, and I'm sure we'll see all the capabilities of this camera, but in a full-frame camera that's more appropriate for portraits. Anyways, let's go ahead and take a quick look at this camera, and I'll go over some of the details. Okay, so taking a closer look at the camera, I'm not going to go over every single detail like I did back whenever I did my first D500 video, but I am going to show you guys some of the things that I've noticed. First thing that I've noticed is that there is a little Nikon advisory out about ENEO15 batteries. Now, basically, and I'll show you guys here, I have an older Nikon ENEO15. On these older batteries, you can actually see on this one, it says Li-ion 01. And so these are basically the ones that Nikon says can have issues in this camera. The newer Nikon batteries say Li-ion 20 on them. Now, you can actually still use the older batteries in this D500. The only thing that happens is they just don't show a full battery charge. So I'll show you guys what happens. We'll put this into the D500. You can see that it shows that it has a little bit. It's not fully charged here. It shows it's a little ways down. This is a battery that came out of my D600, and it actually is fully charged. I'll go ahead and put it in the D600 now. So yeah, you can see that it's fully charged here. In the D500, it doesn't show quite the full charge. So that's basically all that happens. Yeah, it's really not that big of a deal. But if you do notice that, that's what's going on. A bigger issue is the fact that I've noticed that a lot of the aftermarket batteries just don't work at all in this camera. So if you have aftermarket Nikon ENEO15s, be on the lookout for that. Okay, so what else have I noticed in this camera? Well, ergonomic-wise, shooting it has been a pleasure. It's definitely a much nicer feel to me than some of Nikon's other bodies, like for example the D800 and D810. Those cameras still feel pretty nice, but this one has a much deeper grip. As you can see, it's much more akin to the grip on the D750. Oddly enough, the ergonomics of this camera, it actually reminds me of the Nikon F100 film camera. You know, how we have a thinner body and deeper grip. So maybe Nikon is kind of bringing that style back. It's certainly a lot better than the slightly bulbous feeling cameras like for example a D600 here. You can see how the body's a lot fatter, the grip's a lot thinner, and yeah, it just doesn't feel quite as nice in hand. So I guess you could say the D500 has all the right heft in all the right places. It's much nicer to feel. The other thing I've noticed about this camera is, and this is something I didn't think I would use a whole lot, but I do like having this little joystick up here. And this is something that we first saw on the D4 and D4S. So I like having this for autofocus selection. The only downside to it is, unlike using the directional buttons, this button doesn't take the focus points back to the middle whenever you press in on it. So normally if you're using your focus points here and your changing points, you can press the center and they'll jump back towards the middle. Now I would love to show you guys this, but unfortunately on the new Nikon bodies they don't show the focus point display on the back screen like they used to. As a photographer, this is not something that bothers me. So yeah, you can see what it looks like on the older bodies. You can actually see it there. As a photographer, this doesn't really bother me. However, whenever I'm teaching people in class, I really like being able to plug my camera into a projector to show them certain things, while show them the info display and show them the meter and so forth. But unfortunately now it's not possible for me to show them the focus point selection. So I still just use an older Nikon body for that, but yeah, it would be nice if they hadn't changed that, or at least just like give us a menu option to be able to turn that capability back on again. This camera is very customizable, and so speaking of customization, we do have, of course, we have our ISO button on the top of the camera now in a little bit different spot than where it used to be. So we have that there. We also have this function button down here, and this is something that I found to be very useful. I like being able to take a photograph and actually rate it, and that's what it does by default. So I'll show you guys. Just take a shot of nothing real fast. So I like being able to go in here and press this button, and then you can actually assign a star rating to your image. And whenever you do so, I've noticed that that information, of course, translates over to programs like Adobe Lightroom, so it makes things much easier. And we have had a rating system on other Nikon cameras before. I remember seeing it first, I think, on like a D500 or something. But having this button down here that does that by default makes things very easy to work with. Speaking of customization, let's see here. Info. And this camera does have the 2 info button display, just like all the newer Nikon bodies. I always program my preview button for spot metering. And of course you can see our function button here for rating. Now, Nikon, kudos to them for adding more customization in terms of, well, not more customization, but more custom buttons, I should say. The downside, though, is we can't quite customize these buttons as much as I'd like. Nikon could definitely learn something from Sony in this regard. On cameras like the A7R II, you can customize just about any button to do just about anything. I was a little disappointed whenever I saw that this new function button can only be programmed to do just a small group of things. It can only do like the My Menu, access top item in My Menu, or the rating, or not. Yeah, I totally wish we could do something else with this too. I could even see some people liking this as an ISO button. So, unfortunately, we have these new customizations, but we don't really have a whole lot we can do with it. The other thing too that I noticed on Nikon's cameras in that D750, D610, D7000 series range of cameras, basically all their mid-range DSLRs, you have this U1 and U2 custom option here. For whatever reason though, Nikon on their Pro bodies, they still have this really silly custom settings bank thing going on. I wish they would just give us the U1 and U2 on these higher Pro bodies. I have no idea. If a mid-range user or an advanced amateur loves using that on a mid-range body like a 7200, why wouldn't a pro want to have that on a camera like a D500? I will never understand that. So, it's just a couple little things I've noticed. As I mentioned, in terms of shooting this camera, it's not my ideal camera, but I can certainly appreciate the very quick and responsive nature of it. I'll be sharing with you guys some sample photos. You can take a look at those in the description. And if you have any questions about anything, just write me in the comments below. And as always, I try to make follow-up videos that kind of cater to those questions that I see come up repetitively. Be sure, guys, to check me out on other social media channels. I have been still continuing to post a lot on Instagram, and of course Snapchat gives you a very, very good impression of what I'm going to be doing next, because I like to just randomly show things there. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, this is Jeremy Smith, signing off.